Hello everyone, welcome to this session on international trade. International trade has been the heart of economic thought for a long time. This thought laid the foundation of why countries trade and how everyone can gain from engaging in international trade. Trade allows nations to specialize, exchange goods and services, and achieve outcomes that would not be possible in isolation. So in this session, we will begin with the theory of absolute advantage proposed by Adam Smith, which shows how efficiency differences create the scope for specialization and engage in international trade. We then move to comparative advantage theorem, which is proposed by David Ricardo, a powerful insight that trade can be beneficial even when one country is more efficient at producing everything. So from there, we will examine the trade barriers and policy intervention in international trade, and mainly including subsidies, dumping, embargoes that shape the global trading system. Finally, we will connect these theories and policies to the broader economic environment and business strategy, exploring how trade patterns influence competitiveness, job creation, industrial growth, and even environmental sustainability. So by the end of this session, I am sure you will see how international trade is not just about economics across borders, but a key determinant of business opportunities, policy choices, and global independence. So let me begin by defining what is meant by international trade. So international trade means the voluntary exchange of goods and services between countries. So normally the trade and voluntary exchange of goods and services happen mainly through the free market mechanism, and when buyers and sellers freely and willingly engage in market transactions. So when trade is voluntary and there are no barriers, both parties benefit and are better off after the trade than before. That is what we are going to see in this section. So let me begin with one of the oldest theory in international trade, that is called theory of absolute advantage. That is called what are the gains from trade through the theory of absolute advantage. So this one proposed by Adam Smith, who is also called as the father of economics, and through his influential book, The Wealth of Nations. So according to his theorem, countries can gain from trade by specializing in goods and services they produce more efficiently. So in order to illustrate this theorem, let us examine the case of trade between two countries, Portugal and England. So in order to produce these goods, assume that there is only one factor of production, that is labor. So the labor requirement per unit of output, the output here is 1 unit of wine. So here 1 unit of wine and 1 unit of cloth. In order to produce 1 unit of wine and 1 unit of cloth, as per this table, Portugal requires 80 hours of labor in order to produce 1 barrel of wine. And in order to produce 1 yard of cloth, it requires 120 hours of labor required in order to produce the 1 yard of cloth. So let's now move to England. In the case of England require, in order to produce 1 barrel of wine, it requires 120 hours of labor, and in order to produce 1 unit of cloth, 1 yard of cloth, it requires 80 hours of labor. So from this table, what you can see that Portugal has a comparative advantage in the production of wine, because in order to produce 1 unit of wine, it requires only 80 hours of labor. But in order to produce 1 unit of cloth, it requires 120 hours of labor. So at the same time, for England, in order to produce 1 unit of wine, it requires 120 hours of labor. That means it's expensive here, but it requires only 80 hours of labor in order to produce 1 unit of cloth. So what is the main implication from here? The main implication here is that since Portugal has absolute advantage in the production of wine, it can specialize in the wine production, and England has the absolute advantage in the production of cloth. It should specialize in the production of cloth. So instead of producing both goods by both countries, suppose in this case Portugal shouldn't produce both wine and cloth. Instead, it should only produce wine and export. After domestic consumption, it should export wine to England. And what England should do, England should specialize in the cloth production, and after meeting the domestic consumption, it should export cloth to Portugal. So simply what this theorem says that countries should specialize where they are having absolute advantage, and then after meeting the domestic requirement, surplus product, they can sell, they can exchange to the foreign country and import those goods and services that it doesn't have absolute advantage. So by trading, both countries can consume more than they could in isolation. So you can clearly see from this calculation that it's better to specialize. For Portugal, it's better to specialize in wine production. For England, it's better to specialize in cloth and import wine from Portugal. Then another theorem proposed by David Ricardo, it argues that even if a country is more efficient in producing all goods than its trading patterns, then both can still gain from trade. That means called comparative advantage. Assume that one country has absolute advantage in the production of both goods as compared to the other country. Still, it may be having some comparative advantage when it can produce a good at a lower opportunity cost relative to another good compared with its trading partners. So here the gains from trade arise because countries specialize in goods where they hold this comparative advantage. So let us take a illustrative example here. I am showing you the same product, wine and cloth, and the countries are also same, Portugal and England. Only difference here is that now you look at Portugal. Portugal, in order to produce wine, it requires 80 units of labor, and to produce cloth, it requires 90 hours of labor. So you can see clearly that Portugal has absolute advantage in the production of wine and cloth. That means it requires 80 hours of labor in order to produce 1 barrel of wine, and 90 hours of labor to produce 1 yard of cloth. But look at England. England, you can see that in the production of wine as compared to Portugal, it requires 120 hours of labor. And similarly, in the production of cloth, so that means here it requires 100 hours of labor. That means greater than the hours of labor required in Portugal, because you can see that 100, that is greater than the 90 in Portugal. So what you can see here is that in this table, Portugal has absolute advantage in both goods, and about England, it has absolute disadvantage in the production of both goods. You can see that clear difference you can see here. But the key point here is that if Portugal is more efficient in both goods, does it still benefit from trade with England? Because you can see here that why should they, you can just look at this table, you can see that why should Portugal specialize in any of these? Because wine, it can produce cheaply as compared to England. Cloth also, it can produce cheaply as compared to England. Then why should it specialize and engage in trade? But the answer lies in comparative advantage. Portugal should specialize where its relative efficiency is great. Instead of producing both wine and cloth, David Ricardo argued that, showing proper illustrative calculation, David Ricardo showed that Portugal should specialize in those goods it has comparative advantage Forget, it's not just on the absolute advantage. In addition to absolute advantage, there is comparative advantage. It should specialize. Similarly, England also specialize in those production where it has comparative advantage. We know that England has absolute disadvantage in the production of both, but it will be having absolute disadvantage in both. But out of this, where the absolute disadvantage is less in the production of either wine or cloth, looking at that, accordingly it should specialize and engage in trade. So let us go further. So you can see here that the price ratio in autarky means there is no trade. Suppose in Portugal, if there is no free trade, there is no trade between Portugal and England, then the price ratio is going to be like this. Price ratio here is one wine. One wine means 80 units of labor. Then you know that cloth require 90 units of labor. So that means between wine and cloth, you can see that 1 unit of wine equal to less than 1 unit of cloth, right? Because when you calculate the price mainly based on the labor requirement, 1 unit of wine is going to be equal to 0.89 unit of cloth. That is under the scenario of no trade between these two countries. And look at England. If there is no trade, 1 unit of wine equal to 1.2 unit of cloth, because in order to produce 1 unit of wine, it requires 120 hours of labor, and at the same time, in order to produce cloth, it requires only 100 units of labor. So the price ratio is 1 wine is equal to 1.2 cloth. It's all purely based on the labor requirement. We are not taking into account any other, the capital requirement or any other input requirement. So here what you can see that Portugal has comparative advantage in wine production, because here in Portugal 1 wine is equal to 0.89 cloth. And look at, for example, here in the England 1 wine is equal to 1.2 cloth. So if they specialize, suppose here Portugal specialize in the production of wine and England specialize in the production of cloth, both countries are going to benefit, because England too has comparative advantage in the production of cloth. So when Portugal has comparative advantage in wine. So you can look at this figure. So accordingly you can see that the opportunity cost, looking at the opportunity cost, you can see that both country has comparative advantage in the production of each of these products. That means for Portugal it's the wine, and for England it is better to specialize in the production of cloth. So the labor requirement, in order to understand this, in order to understand the comparative advantage, we must look at all 4 labor requirements at the same time. So when you look at the 4 labor requirement, you will come across the concept called opportunity cost. How much you must give up of one product in order to obtain the other, or in order to produce the other. So you can see here, looking at this ratio, you can see that the opportunity cost is written here. It will become more clear when we move here. So look at here, the opportunity cost here. So the opportunity cost for Portugal, you can see that for the wine production, 1 wine is equal to 0.89 cloth, and for cloth, 1 cloth is equal to 1.125 wine. So that means it has lower opportunity cost for wine in terms of cloth. And about England, you can see that looking at this, see this is the opportunity cost, the lower opportunity cost for cloth in terms of wine. So in this case, it is better for Portugal should produce only wine and export wine to England, and England should produce only cloth and export cloth to Portugal. If they specialize in what they have lower opportunity cost and trade for the good which they have higher opportunity cost, both countries can gain from trade. This is the main argument. So to summarize this one in this example, England needs only 100 hours to produce 1 yard of cloth, 120 hours to produce 1 barrel of wine, but Portugal can produce wine using less than 80 hours. So here the key point is that Portugal can produce wine using less than 80 hours than it needs for producing cloth. So assuming the price of cloth divided by price of wine equal to 1/1 with the trade, but this is a simplifying assumption and is really a brave assumption, may not reflect the actual price ratio in the real world, but assume that one wine is equal to one cloth, then price of wine divided by the price of cloth is equal to 1/1 with the trade, then is better for Portugal to produce wine and England to produce cloth and exchange with each other. So this is the more illustrative example or more simplified illustration of the point that we just discussed now. So clearly you can see here that England can use 120 hours to produce 1 barrel of wine itself. That means producing wine directly. Or England can use 100 hours to produce a yard of cloth which it can sell for 1 barrel of wine. Ricardo called this indirectly producing wine. Therefore, it seems to be better producing wine indirectly instead of producing wine directly at the country by England. Is better to import wine from Portugal and export cloth to Portugal. So by producing cloth and trading, England saves 20 hours for each unit of wine. So these 20 hours can be used to produce more cloth either for consumption or trade. So by using this simple illustrative example, what does it show? That countries engaging in trade, both countries can gain by engaging in trade, even if one of the country has comparative disadvantage in the production of all goods and services. Then in order to make it beneficial, look at the opportunity cost, and where they are having low opportunity cost, then engage in that goods and services, then engage in international trade. And in addition to this, there is some more theorems are there. One is called Escher-Oglin theorem. Escher-Oglin theorem argues that countries should specialize in the production of those goods and services where it has based on the resource endowment. That means a capital abundant country will export capital intensive goods and import labor intensive goods. Similarly, a labor abundant country, a labor surplus country, it can export labor intensive goods and import capital intensive goods. Then in that is the case, both countries can benefit. So let me now list out some of the advantages of international trade. One is called it lower cost and increase efficiency. So the case that we discussed in the comparative advantage theorem as well as Escher-Oglin theorem. So countries which is having lower opportunity cost and where it has increased efficiency, it should specialize in those and gain from international trade. And in addition to that, countries can access to resources and inputs. For instance, importing raw materials, components, technologies from other countries can give business accesses to resources and inputs that may be unavailable or more expensive domestically. For instance, you know that India is having shortage of petroleum products. So that resource India is deficient. So India can import that one from abroad, and where we have comparative advantage, for example, textiles production, software and computer hardware production and all, there we can export. And similarly, it will increase market opportunities, and it also helps in economies of scale. Economies of scale means where it has lower opportunity cost. If it specializes in the production of some specific goods and services, then the economies of scale, producing at a large scale, that would reduce the marginal cost of production, and mainly because of the economies of scale, and then it can benefit. And you know that when there is economies of scale, the marginal cost of production declines, profit will increase. And then another advantage is exchange of knowledge and technology, and furthermore it enhances consumer choices. So by participating in international trade, Consumers from both countries can benefit from international trade through access to a broader variety of goods and services, often at competitive prices, leading to increased living standards and quality of life. So having discussed this one, let us now move to some kind of trade barriers that happen between countries. So in this case, let us make a distinction between free trade and trade barriers. So free trade means countries can trade freely with each other. There is no barriers. That means nothing hinders or gets in the way from two nations trading with each other. So that means there is no tariff, there is no quotas. So the countries who can produce the goods and services cheaply, they can specialize in that and they can export this to other countries where it's available expensively. So that means free trade. Free trade means clearly means that suppose other than transportation cost between countries, there shouldn't be any other cost, no trade barriers. However, sometimes countries complain about trade. That means too much trade causes workers to lose jobs and home industries to collapse. So you know that if the foreign country can produce goods and services very cheaply, and then they export all their goods and services to, for example, in India to India. So that means we'll be getting everything cheaply, but at the same time you can see that it causes the domestic industries to collapse, because everything we are importing from abroad, that means the domestic firms collapse and people will lose job. Domestically, the people will lose job. The GDP is going to decline. Government revenue, government tax going to decline. So because of that, countries sometimes try to restrict trade by creating trade barriers. So this is often called as protectionism. Protectionism means in order to protect the domestic industries, domestic producers' interest, and as well as the domestic workers, countries often engage in protectionism. That means they impose trade barriers, which is often called as trade hindrance. So one of the trade barrier is called tariff. There are mainly two types of trade barriers. One is called tariff, the other one is called quota. A tariff is a tax put on goods imported from abroad, that is also called as import duty, and aims to raise the price of the imported product domestically. So as a result, the foreign products become expensive in the domestic market, then making people more likely to purchase the domestic products. So the European Union removes tariffs. However, some countries, they won't impose tariff between them. For example, EU, there is no tariff between member nations, but they impose tariff on non-members. Similarly, NAFTA allows free trade between Mexico, Canada and the United States, but they impose tariff on other countries. So when tariff is imposed, that means if there is a tariff, exporters need to provide tariff. That means the price of when they sell this product in the foreign market, the price of that product is going to be increased. Then as a result, it will be difficult for them to sell. So as a result, the theoretical expectation is that tariff will reduce the trade in on which goods the tariff is imposed, their trade will decline. Another form of trade barrier is quotas. Quota is a restriction on the maximum quantity of goods that can be imported. So taking some of the examples from India, some point of time, India imposed textile quota. That means to protect the domestic textile industry by limiting imports of textiles from specific countries within a given period of time. Similarly, agricultural quotas are there mainly to safeguard the interest of farmers by restricting imports of products such as rice, wheat and sugar. And similarly, there were steel quotas in India in order to control the volume of imported steel to support the domestic steel producers. So let me point out some of the, because you have seen there are two types of trade barrier. One is tariff, that is the tax or price intervention, and quota is mainly on the quantity of goods and services that can be imported. So the reason that quota has some advantage over, mainly in some context, tariff won't work. because if the quota, for example, when the demand is price inelastic, when the product that we are importing from abroad is perfectly price inelastic, when we double the tariff or when we keep on increasing tariff, it won't make any impact. Even the price is very high, we still import that. In those case, tariff won't work. In this case, government will say that this is the maximum amount of units of this product that you can import. That's called quota. The quantity restriction is there. And the second advantage is certainty of restrictions, and then immediate protection for domestic industry, and it also helps in stability of domestic prices, because since import volumes are fixed under quotas, domestic producers are less exposed to a sudden surges of foreign goods. So tariff can still allow large inflows if foreign firms lower their prices. And another form of trade barrier is called trade embargo. Trade embargo is the strictest form of trade barrier. It is typically imposed for political reasons with the aim of hurting the target country's economy. Suppose the country on the other side is a enemy country, then at that time, instead of tariff and quota, we go with the trade embargo. That means strictest form means complete ban of trade between countries, and it's mainly to undermining its political leadership. So unlike tariff or quotas, an embargo usually means a complete ban on trade. So you can see recently the India-Pakistan trade embargo after the removal of Article 370A. There was a trade embargo. That the idea is that a complete ban on trade. Then suppose in order to overcome, sometime domestic country, the government in the domestic country, they give export subsidies to the export so that their cost of production declines, so that they can sell product at the foreign country at a lower price. So the effects is that actually for consumers benefit from lower prices, and foreign producers lose due to reduced world price, and taxpayers in the exporting country bear the cost of the subsidy here. Then some related issues are there, that is called dumping. Dumping means selling goods abroad at unfairly low prices. That means suppose you sell a product in India, for example, 100 rupees, but the same product in abroad, suppose you sell at 50 rupees. That means that is called dumping. But in WTO, there is certain restriction for that. Countries cannot sell like that. They cannot sell the product, goods and services in the foreign market at less than the domestic price. Suppose, as I mentioned, if we are selling a product in India at 100 rupees, the same product cannot be sold in US or UK at rupees 50. That is called anti-dumping. Anti-dumping means policies to protect domestic producers from such practices. Because what happened that government gives export subsidy. So suppose we want to capture foreign markets, the government can give a huge amount of export subsidy, then they can sell the product in the foreign market at a very low price. That is nothing but dumping. But then the producers in that country will get badly hurt. So in order to avoid that, there are several anti-dumping measures. Mainly in the WTO clause, it is clearly mentioned that countries shouldn't engage in dumping. So there are several arguments for restricting trade against free trade. One is called job argument, because it protects trade destroys domestic jobs, because if more goods and services are imported from abroad, then means we are exporting jobs to abroad, right? That means the domestic industries, domestic firm will close down. That means trade destroys domestic jobs. And national security argument also highlighted, especially in the case of critical goods and services, including defense. Another key argument called infant industry argument. Infant industry argument means mainly in the low and middle income countries, new industries, new firms may need temporary protection to develop. That means just like an infant in the infancy stage, it needs support. We cannot ask the infant to walk immediately. So similarly, for the industries, firms when they are in the early stages of their development, they need protection from foreign competitors, foreign producers. In that case, there is a restriction for international trade, but challenge is that it is hard to implement in practice. Temporary protection often becomes permanent, and some industries grow without protection. And there is also called environmental protection, because one example is EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism. They put tax on imports based on the carbon emissions to ensure fair pricing and reduce pollution. So the cost of trade barriers, I have listed some of the cost of trade barriers here. And what we have done in this session is that we discuss what is meant by international trade, and by using the basic theorems, the absolute advantages and comparative advantages, we say that trade enables specialization, efficiency and mutual gains, and it also give the comparative advantage. It explains why all countries benefit even with unequal efficiency. And also we discuss some of the trade policies, trade restrictions, including tariff, subsidies, embargoes, and it all shape global competitiveness. So overall, international trade, it affects jobs, industries and national securities, and it is critical to understand the international trade dynamics, international relationship, and these are all important for businesses, firms, while designing business strategies and to be very competitive in its operations. Thank you for watching this session, and see you in the next session. Thank you.